So it's interesting, actually. So we're distinguishing now. So when somebody says like an open source software mandate, I immediately think about someone telling me I have to go buy open source software, right?
Yeah.
What you're describing is actually for projects that are conducted inside government, when the government is writing its own software, that software should be open source.
Yes.
One challenge we have in the United States is when a program starts up or when a project starts up, the leader of that project will put out an RFP, a set of contractors will bid on the project, they will then create the software, and because there is no explicit language around this in the contract, the contractor is then able to take whatever software they've written and then turn it into a commercial product. And this was originally conceived as a way of kind of creating markets or encouraging private sector adoption of government-funded work. This was created before open source software was recognized as valuable. And so there's talk now of educating these program managers so that when they're drafting these contracts, that they actually exercise some stewardship over the intellectual property that the government is commissioning, right? So rather than having it handed over to the private sector outright and have the government have no role in it once it's produced, instead to say, okay, well, you contractor, you can keep the software, you're allowed to use it and we'll give you rights, but the government will retain unlimited rights to the software, which would then permit the government to license any software that it created under an open source license, which seems to me as a taxpayer, well, you know, I've paid the government to create this, I should be able to take advantage of it. And so this is a relatively new idea and kind of radical, and you can imagine how threatened private industry would be by the fact that well, you know, this is my stuff, right? You paid me to build this, and now I've built it, and now I need to be able to make money off of it. And I don't think anyone's quite figured out how to make this transition. So rather than, you know, we could come down with a mandate and say any software that the government creates should be licensed as open source. But I think it's extremely disruptive, and I'm not sure anyone completely understands what the consequences of that might be. Would it actually undermine the vitality of the companies that are contracting to the government? Would the government even know what to do with it once it was open sourced, right? There's a kind of, you know, you and I are very familiar with open source projects that are just kind of thrown out into the world with no community, and you throw a party and nobody shows up, right? So what do we do with, if we were to put out a mandate like this, what do we do with the software? How does the government ensure that the software that it pays for then has a community built up around it, right?
One example of that would be the Applause software, which was created in the UK for managing, you know, municipal records and municipal systems. So in the Applause software, you could say that the street light in my area is broken, and you know that would kind of raise an alert to the appropriate officer. And then other municipalities in the US, in the UK, started using that. So that kind of a software, that kind of a community seems to be, you know, the most relevant usage of the open source model to drive value across society. And what you described seems to be quite fair to me, because the government has paid for the software, so it should retain some amount of right and control over it. And the open source model seems to be the best way to go. At the same time, the private vendors also have their own right over it. I think that's a fairly good balance, and hopefully things will work out in the near future.
Right, right. So, I mean, it would be interesting to see how business models change. So right now in the United States, I'm not sure what it's like in India. I'd actually be curious to hear what it is like, but there's an entire industry built up around writing software for government, creating IT systems for government. You have large contractors like CSC, Northrop Grumman, Accenture, these folks. They make a great deal of money writing software for the government. It will be interesting to see how they may have to change their business models in order to accommodate all this free software that would be running around, right? They may in fact create practices around building communities for that software, right? So you can imagine, and here this is hypothetical, but you can imagine contracting language that says, okay, well, you have to write this, but as part of writing it, you need to take care of the ongoing maintenance, right?
Yes.
Create a community around it to ensure that it will be vital over the long term. That would be kind of interesting to see the government contracting business put into the business of maintaining open source software.
I think that's kind of an inevitable thing that will happen as more and more software becomes available in the public domain, in the commons.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the Gartner study, it said that almost 80% of software will have some open source component inside it.
Mm.
So I think one is that you now have well-tested, proven software components in the open source domain, which are kind of penetrating inside proprietary silos.
Yeah.
And you now have these proprietary silos which will have to open up.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an inevitable consequence, and
Yeah.
I think it was the Eagles song that said that sometimes you're the windshield, sometimes you're the bug. So people have to choose, do you want to embrace this trend which is inevitable, or do you want to oppose it?
Yeah.
So I think we'll see a lot of people opposing it, but the world has changed. All these contractors will also have to look at how can we create communities around the software, how can we so because unless the community is viable or strong and vibrant and active,
Mm-hmm.
the software does not have a life of its own.
Yeah.
And once the software has a life of its own, you can kind of go out and commercialize the services around that software.
That's correct. Yeah.
So I think for most companies now, that's something that they will have to work out.
Yeah.
And it's both ways, they'll have to work out how they can best leverage open source software from the community,
Mm-hmm.
and how they can create communities around their own software.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That's interesting. That's great. Thanks. Venky.
Thanks.